Welcome and good morning to everyone. My name is Jeremy Pava, and I have the honor and privilege of being the chair of the board of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life. As many of you know, this morning is the inaugural event celebrating the new relationship between the J.J. Greenberg Institute and Hadar. We have an amazing program this morning, and we are thrilled so many people have joined us. As of 7 o'clock this morning, we had over 1,100 registrations, an incredible turnout for an early Sunday morning event. And I hadn't officially registered myself, so technically there's 1,101 registrations. With our relationship with Hadar, the J.J. Greenberg Institute will now be housed at Hadar. The Institute is dedicated to disseminating the Torah of our teacher and mentor, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, a Torah giant of our generation, both spiritually and physically. It is named in memory of Yitz and Blue's son, J.J., who devoted his life to strengthening the Jewish people. Through our relationship with Hadar, we hope to honor J.J.'s legacy by continuing and expanding his work to educate and inspire all of Klal Yisrael to live more meaningful Jewish lives. We hope today's program will be the first step in that path. If you'd like to learn more about the Institute, please feel free to contact me or Ellie Canfor, Shai Held, or Ethan Tucker. Thank you for joining us this morning, and welcome to all of you.
Good morning. My name is Arna Poupko Fischer. I'm not sure why I have this incredible honor of being invited to somehow negotiate this conversation between Rabbi Held and Rabbi Greenberg in celebration of the joining of these two remarkable institutions. I think it's just because they both like me. I think that's what got me in here. I actually want us to begin with a bit of intentionality. We are approaching soon the 8th of Tishrei, the yahrzeit of the beloved son of Blue and Yitz's. And so with their permission, I invite us to think about the remarkable human being that JJ was and the incredible nachas that his parents continue to give and bring to his memory. I want us to have in mind Natan Yosef ben Yitzchak HaKohen v'Bluma HaLeviah, and with your permission to dedicate the upcoming words of what will be remarkable and probably revolutionary, first time articulated in this way, words of Torah of Rabbi Held and Rabbi Greenberg. We're going to divide the discussion, at least that is our intention. If it doesn't happen, ich bin nicht schuldig, which means it's not going to be my fault, into three parts. First, to speak about their upcoming publications. The second is to go to a more meta level, thinking about the various influences and development in their respective thought and theologies. And lastly, to talk about the efficacy and utility of their newest thinking as it relates to our current situation and challenges. There will be hopefully a solid 20 minutes devoted to questions, deep ones only invited. Please, you're welcome to write that in the chat as they occur to you. I'm going to begin with a bit of a formal introduction, but I'm actually going to shorten it because I do believe that everyone who attends is here because you understand that the accomplishments and possibilities of these two great thinkers. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, known, beloved, mentored, and appreciated by so many, is a leader, scholar, and theologian whose influences forever changed the landscape of American global Jewry. His acute humility belies a forceful and courageous vision of God and humanity. He's president of the Jewish Life Network, Steinhardt Foundation of Klal, his life-saving efforts on behalf of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. Rabbi Greenberg served as director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, which Elie Wiesel chaired, which recommended the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and served as the museum's chair. Today formally marks Rabbi Greenberg's newest intellectual, spiritual, and social adventure, partnership of J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Life, of which he is founder and president, with the Hadar Institute. Graduating from Yeshiva University with a PhD in American history, he has written on Jewish religious thought, pluralism, the new encounter of Judaism and Christianity, the ethics of Jewish power, on the Holocaust as a turning point in Jewish and Western civilization, and the state of Israel as the Jewish assumption of power and the beginning of a third era in Jewish history. The author of The Jewish Way, Living in the Image of God for the Sake of Heaven and Earth, and Sage Advice, Rabbi Greenberg has influenced not only the practical direction of Jewish life, but has infused our understanding of Judaism with a sui generis hopefulness and call to action, which he has now captured in his life work, a magnificent treatise entitled, so movingly, The Triumph of Life. Rabbi Shai Held, theologian, scholar, and educator, is president and dean at Hadar, the remarkable institution, and I know they don't like a word movement, but it is a movement, it is a force that he created along with Rabbis Ethan Tucker and Eli Confer. Previously, Rabbi Held served for 6 years as scholar in residence at Kehilat Hadar in New York and taught both theology and halakha at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rabbi Held has been named multiple times in Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, holds a doctorate in religion from Harvard. His academic interests are in modern Jewish and Christian thought, in biblical theology, and the history of Zionism. Rabbi Held publications include Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and soon to be published, Judaism is About Love. Rabbi Held's impressive scholarship and his influence as a gifted teacher continue to animate his significant influence on contemporary Jewish life. How lucky are we on this call to have these two beautiful, beautiful human beings and scholars with us this morning. As we begin to think about Rosh Hashanah, today is, I would say, Erev Rosh Hashanah. We do so in the best possible way, with a discussion, and a Jewish one at that, about life and love. At Rabbi Greenberg's insistence, we will begin with love. Rabbi Held, in your beautiful work on Parshat HaShavua, The Heart of Torah, which is just up there on my shelf, we see the beginnings of Judaism is about love. When you write that the covenant between God and the Jewish people is in part a love affair, a stormy, tempestuous love affair to be sure, but a love affair nonetheless. I had a sneak peek at part of your gorgeous thesis, and I read it as a bit of a provocation, a bit of an utz, a graceful and elegant and kind utz. But if you'll forgive the provocative language, it's almost as if you should have entitled it, Judaism is About Love, Damn It. Please feel free to reject or discuss.
Wow, thank you, Arna. What a wonderful question. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this morning. The way you pose the question leads me to want to answer it in the following way. I think one of the things that the American Jewish community did over time, mostly, though not totally unconsciously, was that Jews began to define Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. And that led to all kinds of really painful distortions of Judaism, and by the way, also of Christianity. So to take just one kind of more tame example, how many generations of Jewish children were taught in Hebrew school, Judaism has no notion of the afterlife? Why? Because Christianity, they were taught, is obsessed with the afterlife, so Judaism must be about something else. One of the most, I think, egregious examples of this, the one that has been at the heart of my own work, is the insistence that Christianity is about love, so Judaism must be about something else. Fill in the blank here. Law, justice, whatever it might be. And that has led to I think, a stunning impoverishment in the Jewish community and an abandonment of what lies at the very heart of our Torah. Christianity is about love in no significant extent because it read the same Torah as we do. And the argument that I want to make is that, look, it's a theological argument, a spiritual argument, and an ethical argument. It's a theological argument, which is that you cannot understand the Torah without understanding it as a manifestation of God's love. We say every morning in Tefillah, Ahava Rabbah Ahavtanu, Torah u'mitzvot limadetanu. You loved us vastly, and for that reason, as a manifestation of that love, you gave us Torah and commandments. What would it mean to have a Jewish theology, to have a robust, living Jewish theology, which takes that to heart, which sees the Torah as about a manifestation of love that seeks in response love from us. The structure of daily tefillah, Ahava rabba avtanu, with vast love have you loved us, ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, and you should love the Lord your God in return. The yearning for a reciprocal, mutual love between God and Israel. It's a spiritual transformation in that you don't need to become a Buddhist or a Christian in order to find a profound commitment to putting love at the very center of your life. The Torah has three loves at its core: the love of God, the love of the neighbor, and the love of the ger, the stranger, the outsider. And obviously I could talk at great length about any of those and all of those, and we should be talking at great length about all of those and about what it would take for us to take seriously those mandates, to live up to them, and to constantly strive to be growing in our loving response to God's love for us by loving God, and again, by loving the neighbor and the stranger. And it's an ethical response in that love includes within it a robust sense of mutual responsibility. God, we know, doesn't just love human beings, but according to Tanakh, God especially loves the widow and the orphan. God pays a special attention to the well-being of the poor and downtrodden. To love God is to strive to love those whom God loves. I cannot say, I love the God of the Torah, but I hate the poor. I have to say, I love God and I strive to love those whom God loves. Just as God loves the widow and the orphan, so must I. That's a lot. It's a theological transformation, it's a spiritual transformation, and it's an ethical transformation. But it is, in the language of the Zohar, milin atikin chadetin. They are old words, which are new words. I don't see what I'm saying as actually all that revolutionary at its heart. I'm just trying to bring to the surface again what has for far too long been submerged and buried under in Jewish culture.
Before I turn to Rabbi Greenberg, Rabbi Held, do you think that this orientation needs to be retaught and it's a long journey? Or do you think that it's in us waiting to be unleashed if only we understood?
An interesting question to which my inclination, at the risk of making a parody of myself, is saying the answer to that is yes. On the one hand, it's going to take a long time to undo the deep, deep ways that this has been submerged. I remember many years ago speaking to a graduating class of rabbinical students at one of the major seminaries. And I said in this very simple way, I said, always remember that Torah is about a God who loves you and asks you to love him back. And a fifth-year graduating rabbinical student sneered and said, you really do hang out with Christians way too often. And I said in response, it's so funny that you say that, I was thinking about the siddur. I was thinking about, as I mentioned a minute ago, Ahava rabba ve'ahavta et Hashem Elohecha. You should love the Lord your God as a response to God's love. Now, is that in us? Yeah, I think a propensity and capacity to love is in all of us. I think that's part of what Tselem Elohim is. And I think it is certainly right there on the surface of Jewish texts. You don't need to go hunting to find a mandate to love in the Jewish tradition. One of my favorite texts that animates me all the time, Rabbi Simlai, the Talmudic sage, says, Torah tchila tag milut chasadim v'sofag milut chasadim. The beginning of Torah and the end of Torah is acts of love. So I do think that, I guess my answer is twofold. It is right there, and it's going to take us, I think, some time and some real work to allow it to flourish rather than constantly closing our arms around it and keeping it inside. It needs to be allowed to flourish, and it's already there. Lo rachoku mikem. It is not, in fact, far. It is available to us.
Thank you. That's hopeful. I'm seeing in the chat a question about where questions should be addressed. If it's easier, just do it to everyone. If you have the skill to do so, you can direct them directly to Morty Labaton, and he will edit them. Rabbi Greenberg, in having the treat over Shabbat of looking through much of your manuscript, I was reminded of a discussion I once had at a Kiddush in Cleveland with a Bible scholar from Bar Ilan, where we were promoting the fact that somehow in the Orthodox community, reading Pshat lost its veneer and is coming back in fashion, and that it was somehow considered frummer to only read with Meforshim. And we delighted in each other's recognition of this, that actually it's closer to God to be looking seriously at the biblical text. In The Triumph of Life, where you present a compelling narrative for Jews, actually the whole of humanity in the postmodern era, this narrative culminates with the proposition that we are in the third era in human history, where humans play the primary role, in your words, the full responsibility for the achievement of the goals of repairing the world. And you mentioned there that the biblical voice is seen as just another in the tradition, and I paraphrase, while the rabbis often add richness and detail. You continue, the biblical paradigm remains the primary model in Jewish civilization. Nothing could match that vision in illuminating the end goals which Jewish religion seeks. And you hang your hat on, in some respects, that philosophical view in offering this position that now in this era, we must be in charge. Can you help us understand that a little more deeply?
Okay, I hope I can control myself and get this done in a reasonable time. But the book which tries to capture, you might say, both the vision, the method, and the application of Judaism, but it starts with this central claim that Judaism is the religion of Tikkun Olam. By that I mean, specifically, it believes that this planet, living flesh and blood, mortal life, can be repaired, improved, and perfected. That's the Jewish vision, to turn it into a kind of a paradise. That's the Jewish, a paradise for all humans, in fact, for all life. That's the vision of the Torah. Now, it also says, however, it's not going to come, and it's not going to be bestowed as a gift from God. It's not going to be achieved by going to the next world or to the future life after death world. It'll happen here, but it'll happen through a partnership. Great covenant, I think, is the core method and the unique contribution of Judaism. So it says we'll repair the world, but it will take literally a sense of partnership in which humans follow God, work with God, but also with the generations and each other to repair and perfect the world. What's the definition of the world perfect? It'll be filled with life, and that life will get the dignity and the value it deserves because of in real life. So human beings as the highest form of life are entitled to dignity. I'll come back to that. But right now, they don't get the dignity they're entitled to. You have racism that treats people of color as inferior. You have sexism that treats women as inferior. You have really a set of things. You have poverty, which impoverishes life, and people can't correct it. So the real challenge becomes, how do we together overcome these enemies of life? There's poverty, there's hunger, there's sickness. These are enemies of the quality and caliber of life. How do we overcome them? And here I come to your question. So the Torah says, basically, this is a partnership. It turns out, at least this is my argument in the book, that God is not only loving, as Shai pointed out, but as a loving person and as a great teacher. Starts it at the level that people are capable of functioning. So the truth is, the biblical vision of this perfectly repaired world, of overcoming the enemies of life, of making the world into a Garden of Eden, that's biblical, and that's why I say we have to restore that and see that Judaism is in the course of suffering, and particularly in the course of exile and exclusion, sort of began to settle for a much less vision of this final perfection. I'm arguing we have to restore that sense that we really have a utopian, in the best sense of the word, religion, but we have the utopian vision backed by a practical way. Now, the practical way turns out to be partnership, and here's where the Bible teaches us something, and the rabbis do, that we learn our place. The Bible says in the first stage, A loving God takes the major responsibility in this partnership. The loving God is the initiator. The loving God is the one who redeems the Jews from the slavery when they have lost hope and they've surrendered to slavery. Sends Moses, initiates the punishments, drives the Egyptian army to destruction because God is responsible. And of course, it cuts two ways, because God is responsible and because the covenant is kind of for the people who are you might say like children. They're just beginning to learn the ropes. They're just beginning to understand the responsibility and freedom. And in fact, the Torah describes that the first generation of Jews who were liberated never did overcome their slave mentality. Nevertheless, throughout the Bible, God is this loving, leading partner who takes major responsibility. And as I say, it cuts both ways. When the Jews live up to faithful to God, God saves them. God smites their enemies, even though they're stronger and bigger, and so on. And here we come to, I think, as I say, one of the important newer insights in the book, but I think it's an important guide to all of us. The destruction of the temple and the period just before it, when the rabbis emerged, the rabbis came with a very striking message. They said this partnership in which God self-limits in order to make room for human joining in this task of repairing the world, it's not a one-time event. God has self-limited again. God is reducing the direct control, the direct influence. And in the Bible, it's really direct control. If you listen to God, it rains. If you don't listen, it doesn't rain. If the Jews obey God, then God destroys their enemies. If Gideon fights the Midianites and he rounds up an army of several thousand and God tells him, send them home, just a few hundred will do it. We want to make clear that God is the leader of this fight. But the rabbis say this is now transforming. The Jews have lived in the covenant for a couple of thousand years already. The time has come for you to take more responsibility. And therefore, God is self-reducing. The obvious examples the rabbis give: no more voices from heaven. If you're going to have the question, what does God want of me? The rabbis are going to have to study the past and use their brains and establish what God wants at this very moment. If you want to know what to do, in the past, God sent you a prophet with a message directly from God. That's over. Now you're going to have to study the text, the tradition, apply it intelligently to this world, and a majority, or at least the consensus, will decide what is the right policy right now. Now, part of this growing up is that humans have more responsibility. So, for example, both temples are destroyed, the rabbis say, because of our sins. But if you look more carefully, the sins of the first temple, they betrayed God. They worshipped idols. They did all kinds of unethical things that God could not stand. And they came to the temple and they polluted it by using it for carrying on evil behaviors and exploitative behaviors. So the rabbis say that the second temple was destroyed for a totally different reason. Now God is more restrained. Humans are more responsible. If you look at their description of the second temple, it's because the Jews were jealous and fighting and mistreating each other. The Jews abused each other, that they revolted recklessly against Rome, the strongest power in the world, at the wrong time in the wrong way. That even when they had fought Rome, they fought each other in civil war. It was impossible. The very famous Talmudic passage that the first temple was destroyed for idolatry, for murder, and for sexual immorality. The second was destroyed because of baseless hatred, meaning the mishandling, the stupidity, the bad judgment, the reckless behavior of humans. But that's the change. The point is that God does not step in, even though they fought in the temple to save and uphold Jewish religion, unlike the first temple. God does not do those kinds of miracles anymore. The rabbis say God is not going to split the Red Sea anymore. God will send miracles that are hidden, such as the Purim story, in which God is present but hidden, in which Mordecai and Esther have to plan to overthrow Haman and to win the king to their side. So the rabbis tell us that in the second stage of the Brit, of the covenant, humans take much more responsibility and the outcomes are much more dependent upon their behavior and their policies, good or bad.
So maybe that's a great place, if I can jump in, Rabbi Greenberg and Rabbi Held, to both of you, a great place to move from theology to actual, to action, to not leave us hanging in terms of what we ought to do. You both wrestle in your upcoming works with both the philosophical and kind of religious tension of concentric circles of concern and responsibility. I'm going to quote from Rabbi Held's work. The general thrust of the text remain clear, Rabbi Held writes. Jewish law clearly embraces an ethic of widening circles of concern. We start at home and move further and further out from there. The way human psychology works is that love and commitment develop locally. No one starts out loving all of humanity. We begin by loving our parents. Rabbi Held, help us with that.
The challenge, as I see it, is how do we orient ourselves to a commitment of family first that does not deteriorate into a commitment to family only, right? So in other words, I think we need to be more healthily and robustly particular so that we can be more healthily and robustly universal. And that's very hard. We live in a culture in which I think it is very tempting to cast the particular and the universal, the global and the local, as an either-or proposition. Either I care about my community and my community is everything to me, or I am always only a citizen of the world and I don't see any local divisions. And I think both of those are impoverished and both of those cut against the fundamental thrust of the Jewish tradition, as you quoted from my forthcoming book. We learn to love by loving parents, by loving siblings, by loving children. And the challenge is to take that love, to be taught to love in such a way that our love can grow outward. We even embody this in the most simple ways in Jewish ritual. I mean, to go back to something that almost feels like a cliche, why is a chuppah at a wedding open, right? On the one hand, it's my house. You would think I would close my house. But the idea is that the love that expresses itself and that grows and flourishes in my home, chuppah is my first home with my spouse, that love will radiate outward such that I learn to interact differently with everyone I interact with and to care more and more deeply. The narcissism of two is not that much better than the narcissism of one. That is not the point of Jewish marriage. That is not the point of building a home. Ultimately, we are asked to take the love we learn and embody in our local places and make it more, spread it out, spread it wide. I think that we live in a time in which there's tremendous ambivalence about particularity. There's a lot of young Jews for whom the notion of Am Yisrael, even young Jews often who are observant of mitzvot, for whom a notion of Am Yisrael is more attenuated than someone in my generation can fully process. And yet, the goal is not to lecture young adults about how their universal commitments are a problem. The goal is to nuance it with a sense of we love our family first. And let me say something about this, because one of the interesting challenges in our culture, I'll call it the Peter Singer challenge, right? I don't owe any more to my sister than I owe to a stranger 6,000 miles away. The problem with that, I would say, is that it runs against the way that God created us. And we have this Talmudic principle, Ana Kadosh Baruch Hu ba b'tronya im habriot. God does not ask us for that which is impossible according to our nature. Judaism works, Jewish ethics, I would argue, works with our nature rather than against it. Or if I can quote from a contemporary philosopher, Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley, who recently passed away, a British philosopher, a great British philosopher, talked about how there are open instincts and closed instincts. We have open instincts to love. right? That is to say, I have an instinct to love my parents, but it's an open instinct in the sense that I can take that love and expand it. And that's where the work of a religious life, or if you prefer a spiritual life, takes place, in the cultivation of a deeper and deeper capacity for love and compassion. If I don't love my parents, or if I don't love, I mean, obviously there are complicated cases of abuse. So let's put it this way. If I don't love locally, I don't really love. But if I only love locally, then in some fundamental way, I don't really love either. So our goal is to raise kids who grow up to be responsible in the way they love their children, the way they love their next door neighbor, the way they care about their most local community, and to know that the needs and the yearnings and the sufferings of other human beings who are also Tzelem Elohim, who are also infinitely loved by God, are also part of their project, are also part of what it means to live a religious life, to care for other people in the deepest sense of the word.
Thank you. Rabbi Greenberg, would you like to
Well, yeah, let me
weigh in?
point to that. My argument is that covenant, the vision is utopian, revolutionary, but the method covenant is very human and very particular, and that's the point. Covenant, a partnership idea is that you respect humans, and even your idea of transforming the world or changing radically the world has to keep in mind this fundamental respect for human limitations, for human existence. So how does that apply to the covenant? Well, the answer is, you want to change the whole world, change it on the human scale. And the way the human scale is, start with the people next to you. Respect human emotions. It's hard to get people to say, I want to love and transform the whole world. Start by where they naturally begin, with their family, with their friends, with their immediate culture, and then widen out. As Shai keeps stressing, the great danger there that you get stuck. You know, you start with your own family is the human way and the respectful way. If you get stuck there, you're the mafia. You have everything for your family and you use everybody else. So that's the challenge, but it respects human emotions. And so the covenant says, if you want to transform the world, but if you change it overnight, 100%, people aren't going to accept that. And even the opponents, what are you going to do? So we see what happened in the last 100 years in communism, or in social, or in aggressive Nazism. In order to perfect the world, you didn't start with your own family and your own individual. What you did is you're going to, just the opposite, you're going to override everybody and just transform everything. You're going to kill anything that stands in your way. What covenant says is that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do. If you intend to start with the whole world, respect humans, that means you'll make compromises and you won't overchange everything in one shot. You'll start with your own family. It appears to be a compromise, but it's a way of respecting humanity, and therefore you will not be tempted in doing what Mao Zedong did, or Hitler did, or Stalin did, which is, since we're out to perfect the whole world, we don't care about individuals. Humans don't count for anything. So this challenge of working on a human scale and broadening out, respecting human emotions without letting them be selfish, that's the heart of the work. And of course, and as Shai has so beautifully stressed again and again, the key motor that leads to that kind of behavior is love. Because again, love starts limited, but if it grows, it embraces more and more and more. And you have to love people enough not only to want to help them and improve them, but to control yourself and not force them. You know, Rousseau argued you have to force humanity to be free. You can't do that, says the Jewish tradition.
I know I'm not speaking hyperbolically, and Rabbi Greenberg, this will make you very uncomfortable, but there is so much love for you on this call. So much so I had to plug in my computer because the power is being drained.
Yeah. You know, it reminds me of my famous joke. You know, there's the famous joke of this Hasidic Rebbe, and his students get up and they say he's the most wonderful and he's the most this and the most smart and the most spiritual. And he gets up, he says, how come you didn't mention my modesty? So my reaction is, I'm a Hasidic Rebbe. I'm so fortunate that my students mention my modesty. There's nothing that, so I would take everything with love, and I would take it with a big, huge grain of salt. huge grain of
You'll,
salt.
you'll play your role, I'll play mine. So with that kind of love in the room, if you could open up something for us, please. I'm thinking about your beginnings at Beis Yosef in Borough Park, the Navardic Yeshiva, and imagining little Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, then just Yitz in the Beis Medrash. Now you are in the World Beit Midrash of Hadar. I imagine there are dots that connect actually quite neatly and congruently from Borough Park to the Upper West Side to Jerusalem, Riverdale. There are also a lot of young people on this call. Can you give us a taste of what that Beit Midrash, that Beis Medrash felt like to you? What still resonates and sings to you and animates you? What have you been forced to reject? And what does Hadar, without speaking institutionally per se, but in terms of, I don't want to put any words in your mouth. Can you speak to us about that trajectory and also those memories?
Well, since you mentioned Beis Yosef and my teenage years in Borough Park, it is one of the great good fortunes of my life. I grew up in a typical modern Orthodox home. It was learned and observant, and I expected to go through the standard modern Orthodox education, climaxing at yeshiva, college, university. Was a teacher of Talmud in Borough Park for Chevra Shatz. It's called a small group of people who learn Talmud every day. Between my house and the shul my father taught was this yeshiva, European refugee yeshiva Beis Yosef. He would occasionally and sit there and learn and use the facilities, and he was kind of impressed with them. Anyway, one day the Rosh Yeshiva says to him, "We're thinking of taking American boys. Maybe you know somebody." So my father came home and said to me, "You know, they're thinking American boys." As I discovered, what he meant by that is Beis Yosef was a survivor yeshiva. Half the students, so maybe 50, half of them survived the concentration camps and the horrors of the concentration camps. The other half survived Siberia, which wasn't much better. I mean, thank God they weren't murdering them mercilessly, but they worked them to death and there was terrible conditions. So half survived one form of torture and the other half. The amazing thing about it was in Europe before the war, they were a wing of the Musar movement, which was started by Salanter in the 19th century to focus on human dignity, human character, human value. And they were frankly the extreme wing of it. I'm not sure if I would have liked it if I would have gone. But in going through the camps and going through the Siberia, you might say some of the anger, some of the hardness, some of the extremism was burnt out. And what was left was, to me, the most amazing thing I ever experienced. There were people with incredible kindness, incredible patience. I never saw anger. There were people who had a kind of an acceptance of life and an affirmation of it. And most of all, they really took seriously the idea that the Torah is about teaching people how to be a mensch. And they worked on it, and there were all kinds of exercises. People would take a week. They had a small group that would meet every week and make a particular anger, patience, kindness, and you'd literally work on it for that whole week, and you'd keep a diary, and then you'd come back and report what you did or didn't do. And what I'm saying is that as a result of meeting these people, I was tremendously moved by their model, their personal goodness. And B, I really ended up being shaped by their idea that the Torah, the most important thing of the Torah is not the details and not the externals and not the rituals, but really to create a human being who's a mensch, who's got the good human qualities and exercises kindness and love for your fellow human beings. So the truth is that, I believe, is what led me come up with this idea of Tzelem Elokim, of the human being in the image of God, the dignity and the value. and the intrinsic value of every human being, who is, as I argue from the Talmud, from the Mishnah, is infinitely valuable, is equal. Every form of image of God is equal. That means color, means gender, that means race, that means religion. Every human being in the image is equal by definition, and the notion that white is superior or woman or male is superior is a form of idolatry. So I think that whole idea really was nurtured in Beis Yosef, including their amazing model, that if you work on it, if you work on your character, you work on your behavior, you can really become what the Torah wants you to be, which is kind and loving and responsible for other people. So that has gone through life with me, and as I say, their personal model was really an amazing pleasure, privilege to be exposed to. What did I leave behind? Well, of course, the honest answer is that they did not have any secular or contemporary culture, and when I went into contemporary culture, it taught me a lot of new things, a lot of important things. In my graduate school, I had the good fortune of stumbling into Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he really transformed my understanding of religion from a religion of ritual and practice and learning, which I loved, but into one that was a world religion that had a vision of what humanity is supposed to try for and do for, and that Judaism has to be responsible for the whole world, and it has to respect all human beings as image of God, etc. So number one is that transforming of Judaism from a set of beloved rituals and practices, good character, into a vision of embracing life in the world. That was tremendously changed. The other major change, of course, came in the encounter with the Holocaust, and we'll come back to that at some point, which really blew me out and blew me apart as a religious Jew and as a rabbi and as a happily fulfilled Orthodox Jew, rabbi. But when that worked me over, first of all, it created a crisis of faith, which has never been fully resolved. I think, as I've said many times, a believer in our time is half the time the believer in times when the events of the Holocaust simply make belief or anything else impossible. But the main application from that led me to, number one, see that all Jews are in this, not just Orthodox Jews. And that started me on the road to pluralism. In fact, the truth is that because of the Holocaust, I joined the Jewish-Christian dialogue to get Christians to stop teaching hatred about Jews, and discovered that they have a fantastic religion too. So that brought me into pluralism. The other great experience of the Holocaust took me 30 years more, and that's what my book is about. The realization that the Holocaust happened not because God punished us, which I reject totally, not because God doesn't care or God is not there, but I believe because in the third stage of the covenant, God asks humans to take full responsibility. God no longer intervenes by pulling strings, by overruling natural order. God operates every day in the closest way, but through natural law, through human responsibility. And then I came to realize that in the Holocaust, that's what went wrong. That God had given humans full authority, full responsibility. That is what's remarkable about our period. It's now full responsibility. But humans had totally failed to exercise. The Nazis did what they wanted to do, concentrate all their power. They carried out a successful industrial mass murder. But the Allies stood by, the neighbors and the bystanders in the local towns stood by if they didn't actively cooperate. And if you study that, I have a chapter in my book, where the neighbors cared and defended the Jews, they saved amazing numbers. The Danes saved 95%, the Bulgarians saved all the Bulgarian Jews. Where the neighbors were actively anti-Semites and helped the Nazis, as in Poland or in Lithuania, 95% died. So I came to realize that we have to understand we're living in a different religious situation. And again, Beis Yosef, they didn't follow me there. They lived in as the Haredim to this day do, live in a sheltered world. But in this world, I believe without Zionism and the state of Israel, without taking power, without taking responsibility, then nobody is safe. And by the way, I should add, we're not the only ones who thought of this. After the Holocaust, not only Jews decided they must take power, that's the state of Israel, African Americans in America, women, gay people, everybody who was a potential victim or was a victim, who was second-class citizen, realized the lesson of the Holocaust, that if you're not strong enough to protect yourself, they can do anything without limit to you because there's such power and available to the evil people in this world. So that third stage, as I say, Beis Yosef had not come with that, but I still feel it's a continuous with them because looking back, I feel what could have stopped the Holocaust would have been Jews to become Zionists to take power. What could have stopped the Holocaust would have been humans taking responsibility, and therefore our response as Jews.
Thank you. We're losing a little bit. I just want to make sure your Wi-Fi is okay, Rabbi Greenberg. Shai, nod if you can hear me okay. All right. So that takes us very naturally into a discussion of the here and now. And I feel that neither of you need any prompts to do so. But just to give you a space to think, Rabbi Held, you write, one of the most fundamental claims. Yeah, we heard you up until the end, but I'm actually going to offer another question, and you're welcome to continue with the thoughts of the last minute that we perhaps missed. Rabbi Held writes, one of the most fundamental claims Judaism makes about the world is that every human being on the face of the earth, black and white, male and female, is created in the image of God and is therefore infinitely valuable. An attack on other people's humanity is by definition an assault on God. And Rabbi Held and Rabbi Greenberg, you should know that as I was preparing for this and taking excerpts from each of your works, I would cut and paste, and sometimes I would look back and say, wait, I didn't write the source. It sounds like Rabbi Greenberg, but I think it's Rabbi Held, and that happened quite often. You spoke so naturally and beautifully to each other. But Rabbi Held, if you can begin with speaking to the challenges of contemporary life right now and how your conceptualization of Judaism being about love can help us think our way through this, your commitment to democracy, racial justice, etc. All in 8 minutes.
Right, exactly. Okay, so first of all, I'm honored if there are ever times when you're not sure if it's me or Rabbi Yitz talking. That's a great honor for me. I have no regrets or apologies about being his student. So I want to say, let me say something first about this question of love and human dignity, which I think are totally intertwined. Imagine that someone approaches you and says, I love you very much, but as for your children, I find them kind of abhorrent. So most people who have been blessed with the gift of being a parent would say, you know what? I don't really need your love if you're going to hate my kids. That's very much how I understand God's relationship to us when we choose to hate other people. You love me, but you hate my kids? That's not really the kind of love that I'm after. What that means is that struggling for the affirmation of the dignity of every last human being on the face of the earth is a sacred religious task. And I want to sort of get at that by saying just a couple of things about Breshit Aleph about Genesis 1 that have been enormously important to me. One is that you cannot really understand what Genesis 1 is saying without understanding that in the entire ancient world, in the ancient Near East, it was kings who were understood as images of the God that society worshipped. And being a king meant being a tselem, being an image, and that meant that they were appointed from creation to rule over everybody else. When you understand the way that the image of God is a title held only by the king in the ancient Near East, you understand how Breshit is doing something that is almost breathtaking in its revolution. That is to say, it is not the king, or certainly not the king alone who is an image of God, but it is every human being on the face of the earth, regardless of race or gender. Every human being is a king. We are all, each of us, royalty. Which means that one of the core questions that Genesis 1 raises to us is, how would we carry ourselves in the world? How would our communities live? How would our country live? How would the globe function if we took seriously the fundamental claim of Breshit Aleph? I often find myself saying, you know, if we took Genesis 1 seriously, I'm not sure we'd ever be able to move on to Genesis 2. Because the claim that it makes and the demands that are implicit in the claim that it makes are so earth-shattering, so utterly demanding of a reorientation of our lives that, you know, it could be the work of a lifetime, the task of a lifetime, or frankly, the task of more than one lifetime to try and live up to that teaching. Also, it's worth saying that Breshit Aleph goes out of its way to say God doesn't just create animals, God creates animals of all kinds, birds of all kinds, plants of all kinds, limino, liminam, liminehem. And then God creates the human being, and you expect the Torah to say, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo limino. God created the human being in God's image in all of the human kinds. And the word limino is not there. Because before we can go on and talk about diversity and even celebrate diversity, as Genesis 11, for example, will do, we first want to establish that there are no kinds of human beings. Nobody's blood is redder than anyone else's, to borrow a Talmudic image. A black person is not worth less than a white person. A gay person is not worth less than a straight person. A person with disabilities is not worth less than an Olympic athlete. And there again, the question is, how do we live up to that? And the way that I think of that is, part of what it means to be a religious person is to keep one's eyes open to the fact that we live in the chasm between the teachings of the Torah and the reality of the world we inhabit, in which human dignity is trodden upon in countless ways every day, in ways that are unspeakable and unfathomable. So how do we respond to being forced to live with and in the chasm between Torah and empirical reality? That's why I think at the end of the day, you can't be a serious Jew without caring about the well-being of those who are particularly downtrodden. Because otherwise you're betraying the fact that Breshit Aleph, Genesis 1, does not really make a claim on us. And so that's the first challenge. The second way that I would frame this is, you know, love is a word. My biggest hesitation in taking on the project of writing about love is that love is a word that has been sentimentalized to the point of being saccharine in our culture. And the love that I'm talking about is intensely demanding. It refers to my inner life as well as my outward actions. Love in Torah is not an emotion or an action. It is an emotion and an action, a way of carrying myself in the world. It is a way of caring amidst a world that was overrun by apathy and indifference. So, you know, one of the questions I think we have when we educate children in Jewish schools, or when we educate children in our own home, or when we try ourselves to be good citizens of the world we inhabit, how do we actually try to raise people who understand the mandate to love, that indifference is the greatest sin there is? Indifference to the suffering of other people is a sign of atheism. It is a direct assault on God. I can't say to you, I love you, but your kid is starving, but that makes no claim on me. I can't say that and mean it with any kind of spiritual or ethical or theological coherence. And that is the challenge. That is the challenge. We live in a time when perhaps we are finally ready to look at racial injustice, both past and present in this country, and the ways that African Americans have been treated as less than human. And I want to be clear, that's not a political project, although politics are involved and good people can disagree about this particular political solution or that. It's a theological problem. The assault on human dignity is a theological problem first and foremost for us. It assaults God, right? The book of Mishlei says, One who gives a loan to the poor gives a loan to God. How I treat the poor is how I treat God. By the way, that's where Jesus got the notion of the least of these. Another idea that Jews think comes from Christianity. Jesus is reading the book of Mishlei. And so I think our challenge is really taking this seriously amidst, in some ways it's hard in communities that are economically comfortable, in communities that are, economically and socially successful and integrated and all of that. How do we take seriously our obligation to love and to struggle on behalf of human dignity? There is no more fundamental religious question than that.
Rabbi Greenberg, I shared with you, I think last night, that in reading through most of your manuscript over Shabbat and also being familiar with your revolutionary approach to understanding where we are now, nonetheless, I waited for, well, how would this all happen? And Rabbi Held also, and by the way, Betsy Strauss, Rabbi Held, just answered your question. How does this actually happen? So I'm going to invite Rabbi Greenberg to read from the last chapter, actually an epilogue in his work that speaks to the pandemic as actually a case study for what his theology might look like in real time. And I'll bring us all into that by reading from page 82 in his work. Rabbi Greenberg writes, the main point remains Judaism as a religion seeks the triumph of life. That fullness of life that it works for is both in quantity and in quality. I propose that this goal should serve as the interpretive principle of the whole of religion. Every commandment, every tradition, every ethical principle and ritual concept is intended to uphold life and roll back death. Rabbi Greenberg, can we impose upon you to read those last few paragraphs of your work and then please comment?
I consider the single most important teaching in my life is this understanding of the intrinsic dignities of an image of God. And it's based on a Mishnah in Sanhedrin, but that's not, the main point is that to be an image of God is to be born with, given, three intrinsic dignities, which are supposed to rule society and life and will someday. That's the messianic vision. But in this world, right now, you're born with those dignities. And the one is, you're of infinite value. If you save one life, it's like saving a whole world. But infinite value means no amount of money is too much to save you, to protect you, to educate you. So that means if a human being is of infinite value, you can't not have medical insurance, so you can't afford to see a doctor or go to the hospital, and therefore you get sick and you die because you don't get treated in time. The whole idea of infinite value therefore means that all our money and all the resources of society must be called upon and given priority to assure the value of life. The second dignity was equality. There is no preferred image of God. God is neither white nor black, nor man nor woman, nor Christian or Jew or Muslim. In short, equality. If you see the person as image of God, you automatically will treat them as equal and as it need to. And if someone else is not, you will challenge them. And thirdly, uniqueness. Every individual in the image of God is unique. That's the difference between an image of man, which can be replicated and duplicated and copied. An image of God is not. It's unique. There's nobody else like you, never will be like you. You are irreplaceable. Now, if you start with those three dignities, I want to come back to Shai's earlier comment. First of all, it took me many years. I asked myself, where did this intrinsic dignity come from? The infinite value or equality or uniqueness of every person. And again, I've had many answers from students over the years which touched me and I liked them. But one morning I woke up and I said to myself, who in my life is infinitely valuable? That I would give away my last dollar. Who in my life is unique and irreplaceable? Who in my life is equal? And of course, the answers have hit me immediately. It's the person that I love. Once I love them, I am irreplaceable. Once I love them, no amount of money, I'd give my life. So it dawned upon me that the source of the being an image of God is love. Now I said, well, how can the Torah then say every human being in the world has these dignities? The answer is obvious, because God loves every human being in the world. Now, by law, Jim Crow law, by constitution, a black may be 3/5 of a person, not a full person. But the Torah has said, you are of infinite value, you're equal, and therefore it's our task to overcome. That's the whole purpose of covenant and the purpose of religion, is to act as a community, as a people, and as an individual, that every act in my life will honor and respect the infinite value of the other, or the equality of the other, or the uniqueness of the other, or will fight to improve the treatment that way. So that's the background of what you asked me to read. I'll be happy to do it, because at the end of the book, I say every action of life, that's what the Torah is telling us. It's in yesterday's portion of the Torah. Moses says, what's the whole Torah about? I place before you today life and good, death and evil. Notice Rambam immediately, Maimonides immediately says, notice that apposition there. Life and good are together, evil and death are together. Says Maimonides, in every mitzvah, every good deed, in every action where there's a choice of life, that's a definition of good. So it's not just eating kosher. How about eating healthy? How about eating responsibly and not fish that are overfished, or animals that are at risk, or as we saw with the coronavirus, animals that are wildlife that had no business being killed in the first place. So this starts every action has to be on the side of life, says Maimonides, and if not, every action that's on the side of death. In other words, that's the Torah's brilliant teaching, that every action of life, the next food you eat, the next breath you draw, the next word you say, the next word you can say can be a word of life, of encouragement, of respect, of dignity, or it could be a word of stereotype, degradation, insult, destructive of people's respect and dignity. So the Torah says that now, so this is the struggle throughout human history and human life, between life and death, and between each person choosing as an individual action or as a community to act on the side of death. Now, what I do in my last chapter, which I will now read to you, I say, I have a little discussion about the coronavirus, which is a classic example where we stand now, because on the one hand, we've unleashed a force of death already. We're approaching 1 million deaths in the world as it spreads, and it's not over yet. It's a force for sickness and for isolation and for crushing so much of the good life. And yet, how do we respond? So my answer again in this matter is, we have to take up the same responsibility. It's the fight of life against death that the Torah calls us for. We have to choose life, which means in this case, social distancing and wearing masks and being disciplined about it. This should be as carefully kept halachically, a mask, as tzitzit or any disciplined ritual. So that's one way. And the second way, of course, no less important, we turn to vaccines and medicines, and we invest in the process of health to overcome illness. These are the responsibilities of a religious person. Now, here's my conclusion, though, as I struggle with this question, because obviously, A, it's not under control yet, and B, there are a lot of people who are not responding very well. And in fact, bluntly, a lot of religious leadership have been part of the problem. I mean, whether it be the people who claim, since I'm religious, God cannot hurt me, will not hurt me, or whether the people say this is a punishment and turn away from the human responsibility. So here's my final paragraph that you asked me to write. As I write, the outcome of this planetary struggle between life and death is far from settled. And again, I want to stress this is not just coronavirus, it's in education, it's in economy, it's in every other way. I may be far too optimistic in my judgment, yet I draw upon the classic Jewish belief that love is stronger than death. Aza kamad ava, love is fierce and powerful and able to fight and overcome death. I believe that the divine wager on human freedom is correct. In the end, therefore, a coalition of humanity will overcome the distraction, the dysfunction, the divisions, and persist in the work of Tikkun Olam until there is full dignity and quality of life for every human being and for every form of life. I told this story because the pandemic is a kind of early warning signals of the next developments on the road to Tikkun Olam. The response to this pandemic foreshadows the direction of religion as it unfolds in history, meaning the characteristics of religion going forward, the centrality of the image of God, an all-out struggle between life and death, leadership drawn from every background, religious and secular. I argue in the book that God has become hidden in our time because God wants not our ritual worship and our religious honor, but that we cross these lines together to fight and improve the image of God, or as Shai keeps saying, to honor and love God by loving God's creatures. The key religious action is in the secular realm. The work of Tikkun Olam crosses all boundaries, and the central task of taking power for the sake of life, this is the central calling, while controlling that exercise of power to keep it focused for life, not to hurt and endanger people. This book is a call to live and act so that future generations will know this generation rejected despair. I believe that humanity will reassert the supremacy of life and recreate the fullness of life after the plague. At the least, may this book be received as a call, however, or whatever its effect, to choose to live on the side of life. And that's something that I really want to stress again. I think Shai is right that it's the emotion of love. God loves life, and it drives us who love life and love God to act this way. But to choose to live as individuals in our personal family life and as a community, I think that is the central calling, and that is the true definition of who is religious and who's not.
Thank you, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. And when the book is published, you still have to buy it, even though you know the ending. So we're going to move into questions. There were some really beautiful questions that were posed, and we're going to call them down to just a few. So to either Rabbi Held or Rabbi Greenberg or both, a two-part question. I'm just going to ask the first part for now. One of the Zoom attendees asked, how do you both ultimately construct your own theology or unearth a theology? It seems for both of you that your theologies are a product of your own deep study of Torah combined with your understandings of history and human nature. And then actually in his part two, there's a bit of a provocation because essentially, if I'm reading the question correctly, you're being asked what's to prevent individuals from creating each their own theology and make terrible errors that actually result in an immoral, unethical, or irreligious outcome. And Jonathan Bressler, if I somehow corrupted your question, I ask for your forgiveness. So Rabbi Held, your own theology, where does that come from, and what's stopping everyone from doing that and getting it wrong?
I guess I'm tempted to answer the first part maybe more philosophically than the question is intended. I'm not sure. Jonathan, you'll email me later and tell me if I'm mishearing you. You know, I think that there are two and probably many more ways of thinking about what our project is in doing Jewish theology. One way is to say, okay, I'm going to look at the world around me and at my experience and think about what can I say about what's ultimate. Another way is to say, I start with a position of being indebted to and obligated by the normative Jewish tradition. I take the categories I'm taught there, and then I bring them into conversation with what I see and experience all around me. I am very much of the latter approach. Would I, starting from nowhere, as if such a thing were possible, end up positing a God of love who does not use God's power as another manifestation of God's love? I don't know. But like everyone else, I live somewhere and I start from somewhere, and the somewhere I start from is Torah. And so my challenge is, how do I read the Masorah? How do I read the tradition? And how do I read it in conversation with reality as I see it all around me? And what emerges is each generation's theological voice, right? Rambam, not comparing myself to Rambam, but Rambam, everyone's great, in certain ways, model for integrating what you learn from the world and what you learn from Torah, right? Learns what he learns from medieval science, learn what he learns from the best of medieval philosophy, and constructs a picture based on that dialogue. That's one of the reasons why, for me, and it's something that is very important to me. Like I find it very hard to imagine a Jewish theology in which God can't be addressed as Ata, you. I find it hard to imagine a theology in which God does not have more will and consciousness than I do, because anything that would have less will and consciousness than I have would not actually be worthy of being called God, it seems to me. So, at the end of the day, we construct a theology based on tradition and experience. And I think this is one of the arguments that I would make, and I've tried to make this in various settings, although never in writing, is that you can't be a theologian in this day and age unless you can imagine secularity from the inside. Secularity is not just a kind of threat that I have to respond to. It's a reality that it's possible to imagine and experience the world as without God. And that means that everything I say has to be said more humbly. It means that I have to learn not just from other religions, but from people who claim no religion at all. It means that a theology has to make more robust room than ever for real doubt and questioning. Now, what prevents, I want to answer the provocation with a provocation if I could. What prevents people from ending up with toxic theologies? Nothing. We see them all around us. Osama bin Laden had a theology, right? The question is, we say in rabbinic tradition that if we merit, religion is a sam chayim, it is an elixir of life. And if we don't merit, religion is sam mavet, a toxic poison, a deathly poison. We know that religion can be that. So the question for me is always not, are you religious or are you not religious? It's what kind of religious are you? I always say I've lost interest in the question, do you believe in God? The question that interests me more is, what kind of God do you believe in? Osama bin Laden was a theist, and the world would have had much less suffering if Osama bin Laden had not believed in the way that he believed. And I'm using Osama bin Laden only because he's the most extreme example from many of our lifetimes. But there are many other examples, no doubt, and in all religious traditions. So the way that I think about love, in part, is that it's a check on me. Anytime I am tempted to articulate a theology whereby religion asks me to be less loving than I would be without religion, that religion is avodah zarah and a toxin. It's idolatry and a toxin. I am constantly challenged to love more and more deeply and to love more and more people. I have this image somewhere. I can't quite remember where it's from. It might be from an article on the Bible by the late Rabbi Robert Gordis. Something like, people say that the God of love is an anthropomorphism. Well, really, show me that person whom the God who loves every last human being is like. Heschel says similar things, right? To love people as a human being is theomorphism. Saying that God loves people is not an anthropomorphism, because none of us ever loves in the way that God loves. We just spend our lives, ideally, in a religious life, trying to approximate and tap into that divine love. And maybe I'll close with that. There's a line in Breshit Rabbah, in the Midrash on Breshit, that I really love, which reads the verse that we're all familiar with from Ashrei. Tov Adonai lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav, the surface meaning of which is God is good to all, and God's mercy is upon all of God's creatures. There's a line in Breshit Rabbah in which one of the sages reads, that's not what the pasuk means. The pasuk means God is good to all, and God gives of God's rachamim to us so that we are able to put it forward into the world. Any religion that leads me to be less compassionate, less merciful, is a toxin. a religion that leads me to be more merciful, that leaves me aware all the time of how short I fall of God's own love, that's a religion worth embracing and growing with.
Can I just add a comment? There's a lot of mean to what you just said, but I'd like to add a comment this way. The reality, the reality is, I mean, I think Torah, Revelation, God is reaching out to get humans to join in this partnership, in this process. There's no way of understanding what God is asking except interpreting it our best we can. This culture has very sophisticatedly forced us to see that no matter what, the reading is shaped by our capacity and our insight. So I acknowledge the tension that you pointed out to. On the one hand, I'm trying to really embrace the whole tradition. And on the other hand, I'm trying to read it fully using the techniques and the insights of my time and my culture. So here's my point. Undoubtedly, I can make mistakes. I will miss many things. Undoubtedly, as Shai pointed out, with many toxic applications. So what cheers me up and what is a crucial part of my own personal life and thinking is pluralism. Because I sort of feel the good news is, no matter how mistaken I am, there'll be somebody out there who disagrees. And because it's a pluralist culture, no one can silence them. And I sleep better at night knowing there are people out there who will challenge or refute all my mistakes and will try to get me to turn back from my really dangerous tendencies. So to me, pluralism is critical, and in each culture, each religion, each position, each theologian should not only work for pluralism, should welcome it, should encourage it, should ask. And that's like another reason why I say I love my students who don't simply echo me, but who will challenge me and critique me and correct me, because this is the best protection we have. The human variety and the diversity, that's the power of free society and a free culture. And we have to defend it at all costs.
Jonathan, you got two amazing answers. Rabbi Greenberg, here's another question as we move towards closing the event. We need God's love and God needs our love. Does God's need for love make us uncomfortable? Can we accept that God has a need which seems very human? And I'm going to direct that to you, Rabbi Greenberg.
No, I would say here's where, again, let me attack Maimonides. In other words, I think Maimonides' incredible theology and the model for us, I accept all that, and of course, I've tried my best to learn from in every way. Nevertheless, Maimonides, out of the faithfulness and integrity of his philosophy, concluded that we should avoid, fight, reject any anthropomorphic understanding of God, including all these emotions. The bad news is that Maimonides won the argument, at least among many religious Jews, and therefore there has been a kind of resistance to this kind of speaking about God that way. But to me, that's where the recovering the biblical, where the Bible has no embarrassment, in fact, centrally stresses all these human characteristics, including love, but of course, including sometimes anger and jealousy, things that I'm not so happy about, and which I don't spend much time on in my theological writing. But yes, recovering the God's emotion as the model for us. Again, we know anything we say about God, these are fractional, these are finite. It's like the three blind men describing an elephant. We're missing a lot. But in that limited, flawed, restricted way, we have no other choice. If we want to be close to God, we want to get God's availability to us. And that, to me, again, is part of the lesson of the Jewish history, that God has made God smaller, more hidden, in order to enable us to receive, to be open to experience God in many more places. When God was all-powerful, when if you looked at God, if you touch God, if you touch God's throne, God's ark, you drop dead on the spot. That period is over. God himself, this is what the rabbis taught me, and I think it's gone further in my lifetime and yours. God becomes more hidden. God becomes Shekhinah, more gentle, more soft, if you will, more feminine and more loving, in order to become closer. So now we can meet God in our bedroom, we can meet God in our kitchen, we can meet God everywhere. And I think we're now living in the climactic moment when literally God is everywhere present, but you have to, it's not visible, you have to dig deep. And as Shai has repeatedly said, and I totally endorse, in a time when God is totally hidden, you have to dig deep. The single most powerful way you can make that connection and discover the God of love who is sharing you and sharing your life and your pain is by seeing another human being or helping another human being as an image of God. And seeing this person in all their preciousness, value, and uniqueness, it evokes our sense of what is behind it, the source, that infinite source that we can only touch the tip of the iceberg, but in that part of that tip, we have to say it again and again, is that tip of love, that tip of concern. I'll offer another interpretation of that verse. Tov Hashem, God is good to all. V'rachamav, says Hirsch, means God's rechem, God's mother love, is on all God's creatures. That's how God feels about all of creation, all creatures. Mother love, with that intensity, with that feeling, it's flesh of my flesh and blood of my bone. It's a sense of, this is my whole pleasure, this is my whole value. So again, whether that may be a false or anthropomorphic variation, but at the least, it's the model for what we should be trying for, and that we should be imitating God. That's really, the Torah says that 10 different ways. Imitate God, become more like God, and the way we become more like God is to become more loving.
Thank you. Rabbi Held, as we move towards closure, such a Jewish thing to say, God forbid closure, but we're moving towards closure. If you could just spend a few minutes for everyone on this Zoom, if we can get inside your head and your heart a little bit. Sharing with us, I asked Rabbi Greenberg about the Beit Midrash of his youth, and now to speak to you about the Beit Midrash of the present and future with Rabbi Greenberg now a full participant. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to the institution? And I know at the end you have a surprise announcement about what it might mean to you and will mean weekly from Rabbi Greenberg.
Thanks, Arna, and thank you to everyone for having been with us in this conversation. You know, the vision that we have had for what the Hadar Beit Midrash is, you can describe, I think, in some very straightforward ways. We want a Beit Midrash in which there is full and total and deep emotional and intellectual immersion in the tradition, and, not but, and a full embrace of the modern world when it has things to teach us. We want a world in which we are committed to the authority of tradition and unapologetically to gender equality. We want a world in which we believe the vastness and the richness of Torah is infinite, and we have a tremendous amount to learn from general culture and secular philosophy. It's a whole lot of ands instead of buts, right? It's about embracing all of it. And crucially, it is a Beit Midrash where no human experience and no account of human suffering is ever pushed out of the room because somehow someone finds it threatening. It is a Beit Midrash that is about listening, that is about part of, and this goes back to Jonathan's question, part of what it means to interpret a tradition responsibly and lovingly is to listen to the voices of those who are affected by it, right? To listen to how people are affected by the Torah as it is taught to them and even about them. We want a Beit Midrash that is committed to a particular vision of what Jewish life can and should look like in the 21st century, and the Beit Midrash that belongs to all of Am Yisrael. We're very proud of the fact that, for example, when we run our rabbinic programs or our educator programs or our executive seminars, people come from every point on the denominational spectrum and from no point at all. And they learn together on the simple principle that Jews should learn Torah, and they should learn Torah with people they wouldn't ordinarily learn it with. And in so many ways, what I've just said describes a lot of the Torah that Yitz has spent his life teaching. So what I have said to Yitz is, any program we run, you are welcome to be faculty in. We would love to have you. I'm excited to say that this year's Rabbinic Yeshiva Intensive will include a mini course taught by Yitz Greenberg. And we want to be and are proud to be an institution that takes Yitz Greenberg's Torah that is so much about the things I've said and helps put it forward in new forms and helps another generation of young Jews encounter Yitz's Torah. That's really fundamental to us. It's not that we do what Hadar does and we're doing this side piece with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's teachings. It's that Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's teachings and who and what Hadar is are so thoroughly integrated. They have so much in sync with each other that it's a natural and organic next step for us. We want this to be a Beit Midrash for the whole Jewish people. If you've never been to any online class with us other than this dialogue, please look at what we're offering. If you've never been to our Beit Midrash and you're physically able, we hope that you'll join us when the pandemic finally ends and our Beit Midrash is open again for in-person learning. We are honored to make whatever contribution we can make to the unfolding of God's covenant with the Jewish people and to the vibrancy of Torah in our time. One of the many ways, and a very special way, that we hope to make the vibrancy of Torah alive in the coming year is that our weekly Dvar Torah, that in the past has been written by me for 2 years, which led to the Heart of Torah, by Dina Weiss, by Rabbi Ethan Tucker, by Rav Avital Hachstein. This year, beginning on Parashat Breshit, the weekly Dvar Torah from Hadar will be written by my teacher, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. If you are not subscribed to the Hadar Dvar Torah, on the chat right now, there is a link where you can sign up, and there you could also do that through our website. If you want a weekly fill of Rav Yitz's Torah, that is a great way to have it. And I hope everyone in this room sees Hadar as one of its Jewish homes and a Beit Midrash that belongs to you, that seeks to serve you, and more importantly, that seeks to help you serve God and to keep the Jewish people alive, vibrant, thriving, and responsive to the will of God in our time. So thank you, Arna, so much for moderating this discussion. Thank you, Rav Yitz, for all you've given me and us for all these years and for trusting us enough to be part of what we're doing, and to all of you for your support and your love of this work.
Thank you. We're now going to invite Rabbi Avi Killip to close the event, and to Rabbi Greenberg and Rabbi Held. As my son Avi Poupko would say, you've exploded our minds and, more importantly, perhaps our hearts. Rabbi Killip, please.
One needs to, there we go. Hi, I am Rabbi Avi Killip. I'm VP of Strategy and Programs at Hadar. Thank you all so much for joining us for this momentous and inspiring talk. We want to thank Rabbis Shai Held and Yitz Greenberg for their endlessly thought-provoking words, and Professor Arna Poupko Fischer for her artful moderation. As Rav Shai just said, we're especially excited to announce that Rabbi Greenberg will be the author of Hadar's weekly Divrei Torah series, so you can subscribe to the weekly series by clicking in the chat where we just dropped the link. There are so many ways to continue the learning that we've started here. Check out hadar.org for ongoing classes, our recently released High Holiday Reader and High Holiday Halachic Guide, and more are on our website. This is just the beginning of a wonderful partnership between Hadar and the J.J. Greenberg Institute, and we are so glad that you could be here to support this endeavor. We look forward to seeing you at future Hadar and JJGI programs. And finally, if you are registered for the Detroit Q&A, now is the time to head over to your other Zoom room. Hope everyone has a great day or evening, depending where you are. Thanks.